All right, so today we're going deep.
Deep.
Yeah, deep into 1939.
Ooh.
And I'm really excited about this one because this is a year.
Big year.
Huge year.
Yeah,
So much happened.
absolutely.
We've got this amazing timeline that we're going to be working with.
Yeah, it's incredible how much they managed to pack into this.
I know. I was looking at it earlier and I was like, how are we going to get through all of this?
Day by day.
Day by day.
It's going to be dense.
It is. But it's going to be exciting. It's 1939.
It is.
The year that everything changed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's easy to think that 1939 just sort of appeared out of nowhere, but the world was already kind of a powder keg.
Yeah.
Even as people were celebrating New Year's Eve in 1939,
Right?
the Second Sino-Japanese War was already in its third year.
Wow. Yeah. So not exactly a happy new year for everybody,
No, not at all.
especially in Asia.
Yeah.
And what about Europe? Because obviously when we think about 1939, we think about Europe.
Yeah, Europe is you can almost feel it, right? This sense of dread
Yeah.
looming.
Yeah, like holding their breath.
Exactly. Everyone knew Hitler was a threat,
Right.
but nobody knew when or where he was going to strike next.
Right. So let's jump ahead. I want to get right into the action
Yeah,
because
let's do it.
there's so much to cover.
Absolutely.
And we've got September 1st,
September 1st.
Germany invades Poland.
The official start of World War II.
Yeah. And it starts in such a dramatic fashion.
It does. It's almost like a scene from a movie.
Right.
You've got this German battleship,
The Schleswig-Holstein.
the Schleswig-Holstein,
Yeah.
opening fire on this Polish military depot at Westerplatte.
Right.
It's a very calculated act of aggression.
Yeah. But then on that very same day,
Oh, yeah.
we see the real darkness.
The dark side of this new kind of war.
Yeah. The Luftwaffe
The Luftwaffe,
bombs the town of Wieluw.
a civilian target.
Completely civilian.
It's the beginning of what we would come to call carpet bombing.
Right. Just terrorizing the population.
Exactly. Making it clear that this was a new kind of warfare.
And the world reacts immediately.
Yeah.
Britain and France
Ultimatums.
to issue ultimatums to Germany.
Right.
Other countries are scrambling to declare neutrality.
Yeah, trying to stay out of it.
And there's even mention here in the timeline of Operation Pied Piper,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
the evacuation of British civilians.
Mostly children.
Imagine that.
It's hard to even fathom
The fear, the uncertainty.
the scale of it.
Yeah, and not just governments reacting. There's also the mention of Operation Tannenberg.
Oh, yeah. Operation Tannenberg.
That's one I'm not familiar with.
This is a really chilling aspect of the early stages of the war.
Yeah.
It was essentially a program of targeted killings
Oh, wow.
orchestrated by the Einsatzgruppen.
So this is Hitler's death squad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were targeting intellectuals, community leaders, and anyone they thought might resist Nazi rule.
So right from the start,
Right from the start.
we see this brutality.
Yeah, this deliberate targeting of civilians that would become a hallmark of the Nazi regime.
A hallmark of the Nazi regime.
Yeah, it's a dark preview of what's to come.
And, we talk about these big events, but then there's these little details that I find so fascinating.
Little details are often the most revealing, aren't they?
They are. And I noticed here that it says the first British military action wasn't like a bombing raid
No.
or sending in troops.
There's a leaflet drop.
A leaflet drop.
Propaganda warfare from day one.
It almost seems quaint compared to everything else that's going on.
It does, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
it shows how seriously they were taking the propaganda war.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then on September 3rd,
September 3rd.
things take a darker turn at sea.
Yeah.
The Athenia
The Athenia, a British passenger liner.
is torpedoed by a German U-boat.
This is the official start of the Battle of the Atlantic
Wow.
and a terrifying preview of the unrestricted submarine warfare that was to come.
Yeah, no one is safe.
No one is safe. Neutral ships, civilian casualties.
It's just a chilling escalation.
Yeah, and then it's like a chain reaction. You
Yeah.
see Britain and France declare war, obviously.
Right.
And then Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa.
It's like dominoes.
It is.
Ah.
This ripple effect really highlights the global scope of what's unfolding.
And we see some countries trying to stay neutral.
Yeah, the United States famously declares neutrality.
We've already seen that neutrality doesn't mean you're safe.
No, it doesn't, especially in this kind of war.
Right. And there were other countries that were kind of trying to find this middle ground,
Yeah.
like Ireland.
Ireland declared non-belligerent.
Non-blue. What does that even mean?
It's a fascinating concept. Basically, they were saying, we're not going to join the fighting,
Right.
but we're also not going to stop Germany from using our ports or airspace.
Oh, so trying to have it both ways.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Walking a very tight tightrope.
So while all this is going on,
Yeah.
what's happening in Poland?
Tragedy, basically.
Yeah.
The German army using what they called Blitzkrieg or a lightning war,
Right.
just advancing rapidly.
And we see the siege of Warsaw.
It's the Siege of Warsaw, which ultimately falls.
And then to make matters worse,
Oh, yeah.
the Soviets invade from the east.
The Soviets invade from the east. This is where that secret pact between Hitler and Stalin comes into play.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Exactly. They had carved up Eastern Europe between them, and Poland was caught right in the middle.
A victim of their own geography.
Sadly.
And it's just heartbreaking to read about events like Bloody Sunday in Bydgoszcz, where ethnic Germans were killed in these revenge attacks.
It's a cycle of
It's
violence,
a terrible cycle.
and it's only just beginning.
But even in the midst of all this horror,
Yeah.
there are these glimmers of defiance.
There are.
The timeline mentions the Polish submarine Orzeo,
Or Zio,
which manages to escape from Estonia.
while being pursued by both German and Soviet forces.
Imagine the tension.
Talk about a close call.
Yeah, but then in the West, things are strangely quiet.
This is the period that people call the phony war.
The phony war.
From September to the following spring, there's very little land action on the Western Front.
It's like this eerie lull.
It is, like everyone's holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop.
But surely something's happening somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. The war at sea is heating up.
Right.
You have the sinking of the Courageous, the first major British warship lost.
A sobering reminder that even when things seem quiet, lives are still being lost.
Exactly. And then you have this incredible story of Günther Prien.
The Prian, okay.
He was a German U-boat commander,
Right.
and he pulled off one of the most daring raids of the war.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
He managed to sneak his U-boat into Scapa Flow,
Flow.
the main British naval base in Scotland.
Wow.
It was supposed to be impenetrable,
Yeah.
but Prien found a way in,
Unbelievable.
and he sank the battleship Royal Oak
Right under their noses.
right under their nose. It was a huge blow to British morale.
I can imagine. So we've got this naval cat and mouse game going on.
Yeah.
The Soviets are making their move in the Baltic.
The Soviets are on the move.
It seems like every corner of Europe is on fire.
And it's about to get even hotter. The Soviets, emboldened by their quick victory in Poland, set their sights on Finland.
Finland, this is where we get the Winter War.
The Winter War, David versus Goliath.
A classic underdog story.
Absolutely. The Soviets, using a staged incident they called the shelling of Manila.
Staged, so they were looking for an excuse.
They wanted control of Finland for strategic reasons, and they weren't going to let a little thing like international law get in their way.
And how does the world react to this?
Well, the USSR is promptly expelled from the League of Nations.
Talk about bad PR.
Yeah, not a good look.
But the Finns weren't just going to roll over.
No, they were not. They put up a fierce resistance using their knowledge of the terrain and some incredibly clever tactics.
Yeah, I love those stories of the Finnish soldiers on skis just taking out these Soviet tanks.
It captured the world's imagination. This small nation standing up to a giant.
Yeah, it's inspiring.
It is. And it shows how the events of 1939 were already resonating beyond borders.
This is far from just a European conflict.
Far from it. And it's only November. We've still got a month to go, and things are about to get even more intense.
I can't wait to dive into the rest of it.
Me neither.
It's amazing to think that while this is all happening over in Finland,
Yeah.
the rest of the world is watching
The world is holding its breath.
this David and Goliath struggle
Exactly.
playing out in the snow.
In the forests of Finland.
And it's fascinating to me how the Winter War
Yeah,
ends up impacting other countries,
it does.
like the Baltic states,
Especially the Baltic states.
Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Right in the crosshairs.
Yeah, caught between these two big powers.
You know, it's interesting because the Soviets had already forced those mutual assistance pacts on them.
Right back in like October, I think it was.
Yeah, earlier that year.
So they were already kind of in a precarious position.
They were in a very precarious position.
But then the Winter War happens.
Yeah, and I think it really spooked Stalin because he saw how much trouble his Red Army was having against the Finns.
Against this tiny little country.
Exactly. And I think he realized that he needed to tighten his grip on the Baltic states.
So even though they were technically neutral,
Technically neutral.
they were basically sitting ducks.
Yeah, sadly they were.
And that's exactly what happens.
It is. In the summer of 1940, the Soviets staged these sham elections.
Right.
And they install puppet governments.
In Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania,
Gone.
they're absorbed into the Soviet Union.
Just like that. Another example of how quickly things could change.
It's really frightening how quickly things can change.
It is. It shows you how fragile peace and stability really are.
So while all this is going on,
Yeah.
what's Hitler up to?
Well, Hitler's not resting on his laurels, that's for
I
sure.
know.
The timeline shows that in October 1939, he issues orders to prepare for the invasion of France and the Low Countries.
So the phony war is about to get very real.
Very real indeed.
And it's not just France.
No, in October, the German Navy suggests to Hitler that they need to occupy Norway.
Norway. Why Norway? What's the logic there?
It's all about resources and geography.
Okay.
Norway had these vital iron ore supplies from Sweden,
Okay.
which shipped through Norwegian ports.
Right.
So controlling Norway would give Germany access to those resources.
Essential for the war effort.
Absolutely. And it would also give them a huge advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic.
So Hitler's thinking several moves ahead.
He's playing 3D chess.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's this combination of strategic brilliance and utter ruthlessness.
A dangerous combination.
Extremely dangerous.
So we've got all this going on, and the war at sea is still raging.
The Battle of the Atlantic is relentless.
And this is where we see some really interesting technological developments.
Oh, yeah.
Like the Germans are using these magnetic mines,
Magnetic mine?
which I had never even heard of before reading this timeline.
They were a new weapon at the time.
How do they work?
So instead of being triggered by contact like a traditional mine,
Right. They're set off by the magnetic signature of a passing ship.
wow.
It was a nightmare for the British.
Yeah, I can imagine.
They were losing ships left and right.
And this is also when radar starts to become really important.
Radar is a game changer.
Yeah.
The British recognize its potential and they invest heavily in it.
Smart move.
It gives them a huge advantage in detecting German ships and aircraft.
So you've got these armies clashing on land, but then you have this whole other war being fought in the labs and workshops.
The technological race is just as important as the battles on the front lines.
And it's something that's going to continue to escalate throughout the war.
Absolutely.
So going back to the timeline, I see some interesting details here about the fighting on the Western Front.
Okay.
Because remember, we're still in that kind of phony war period.
Right.
But it says that the first German attacks weren't bombing raids or tank assaults,
They weren't.
but artillery barrages.
In late September 1939, German guns on the Siegfried Line opened fire on French villages.
So more of a symbolic gesture? Yeah. More of a show of force than a serious attempt to break through.
Almost like they were testing the waters.
Exactly. Seeing how the French would react.
And there's this mention of a speech that Hitler gives in October
Oh, yeah.
where he calls for a peace conference.
This is classic Hitler.
It seems a little out of character for him.
It does, doesn't it? But he knew that the British and French were hesitant about a full-blown war.
Right.
And he tried to exploit that by posing as the peacemaker.
Well, he wasn't serious, was he?
Not a chance. It was a delaying tactic,
Okay.
giving him more time to prepare for his invasion of France.
And the British and French weren't fooled?
No, they had learned their lesson from Munich.
Right.
They rejected his offer.
And this feels like a real turning point.
It is. The hope for a negotiated settlement is gone.
Yeah.
And everyone knows it's just a matter of time before the real fighting begins.
And it really galvanizes the Allies, doesn't it?
It does. They know that appeasement has failed,
Yeah.
and that defeating Hitler is going to require a full-scale commitment.
It's incredible to think that all of this has happened in just the first few months of the war.
It's a whirlwind.
It is. And as we move into the last few months of 1939, we see the war starting to touch the lives of ordinary people.
Yeah, it's no longer just headlines and maps.
Right? It's coming home.
It is.
So the war is no longer just headlines and, maps and things like that.
No.
It's coming home to people.
Yeah. In November, Britain implements this nationwide registration system to conscript men for military service.
Wow.
It's a really stark reminder, isn't it, that
Yeah.
this is getting real?
Yeah.
It's no longer something happening over there.
Right.
It's your son, your brother, your neighbor.
Right.
They're all potentially going off to fight.
And I also noticed here that the timeline mentions the Ministry of Food being established in Britain.
Yeah, they knew wartime shortages were coming.
Right.
So the government stepped in to control the food supply.
So rationing.
Rationing becomes a part of daily life.
So even though British troops aren't really engaged in major battles at this point,
Right.
the war is already affecting everyday life.
Absolutely. Rationing, blackouts, air raid drills.
Right.
This becomes the new normal.
Yeah.
And across the channel, the French are experiencing it the same thing.
It's really interesting how this timeline captures not just the events, but the mood.
Yeah, you can almost feel the world holding its breath.
Yeah.
bracing for what's coming.
And then you have things like the Venlo incident,
The Venlo incident.
where 2 British intelligence officers are kidnapped
By the Germans.
by the Germans in neutral Holland.
In neutral Holland.
So nowhere feels safe.
Exactly. It's like a spy thriller playing out in real life.
Yeah, and meanwhile, back in Czechoslovakia,
Oh, yeah.
things are going from bad to worse.
Under Nazi occupation,
Yeah.
the timeline details growing resistance.
Okay.
Especially among students.
Mm-hmm.
There are protests which are brutally crushed by the Gestapo.
Wow.
Mass arrests, deportations, the closing of universities.
Just a clear sign of how the Nazis dealt with dissent.
Ruthlessly.
And this repression isn't limited to Czechoslovakia.
No, the timeline mentions that in November, Adolf Eichmann starts deporting Jews from Austria and Czechoslovakia into Poland.
The Nisko Plan.
The Nisko Plan.
It's a horrifying glimpse of what's to come.
It is. It's the beginning of the Holocaust.
Yeah, the systematic persecution.
Jews and other minorities.
It's a chilling reminder that 1939 wasn't just about territorial ambitions.
No, it was about something far more sinister.
Yeah, and this is why understanding 1939 is so important.
It's
It
crucial.
wasn't just the start of a war.
It was the start of one of the darkest chapters in human history.
It's a sobering thought,
It is.
but an
I-
important one.
We can't just gloss over the past.
No, especially when it holds such important lessons for the present.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 1939,
Yeah.
it's clear this wasn't just another year.
Yeah.
This was a turning point.
A year that set in motion forces that would shape the world for decades to come. We saw the rise of totalitarian regimes,
The outbreak of global war.
the beginnings of a genocide.
Almost impossible to grasp the full scope of it all.
It is. But even within all of this chaos and darkness,
Yeah,
there are these stories of courage and resilience.
absolutely.
The Finns fighting against all odds.
The Polish submarine escaping capture.
Yeah.
Ordinary people in Britain and France facing down the threat of war.
It's that mix, I think, that makes 1939 so compelling.
The darkness and the light.
Yeah, it shows us the very best and worst of humanity.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable horrors, the human spirit can endure.
So as we step back from this whirlwind year, what stands out to you the most?
For me, it's the importance of choices.
Choices?
The decisions made in 1939 by individuals, by governments, they
Right.
had far-reaching consequences.
Consequences that we're still dealing with today.
Exactly. It makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what if different choices had been made?
Yeah, what if the Allies had stood up to Hitler sooner?
What if the Soviets hadn't been so paranoid and aggressive?
Would the world be a different place today?
We can't know for sure,
We can't.
but it's a question worth pondering.
It is. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But it's been an incredible journey exploring this pivotal year with you.
I've enjoyed it.
And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on 1939.
A year that continues to resonate with us even today.
Keep exploring. Keep asking questions.
And never forget the lessons of the past.